Once upon a time there lived a king and a queen who had only one son, in whom they centered all their hopes. He was 14 years old at the time from which this history commences, and the queen had given up all hopes of having any more children. The prince was handsome to admiration, and learned with facility all that was taught him. The king and queen doted on him, and their subjects made him the object of their tenderest affection. For, though he knew very well what distinction was necessary to observe toward the several persons who approached him, he was affable to all. He was called Zirphil. As he was their only son, the king and queen resolved that he should marry young, that they might hope to see princes, his sons, worthy of wearing their crown, if unfortunately Zirphil should be taken from them. Search was accordingly made, on foot and on horseback, for a princess worthy of the heir apparent. But, notwithstanding, a suitable partner for him could not be found. At last, after many inquiries had thus been made, the queen was informed that a lady, very closely veiled, requested a personal and private interview with Her Majesty in order to confer with her on a very important affair. The queen hastened to her throne to receive her, and gave orders for her to be ushered into her presence. The lady, on being admitted, walked up to the queen without removing her large white veil, which reached from her head to her feet, and entirely concealed every part of her person. When she had arrived at the foot of her throne, "I am astonished, O queen," said she, "that you have even dreamed of marrying your son without consulting me. I am the fairy Marmotta, and my name is too well known for you not to have heard of me. I am mortally offended, and as a commencement of your punishment, I command you to marry your son Zirphil to a person whom I have brought hither for that especial purpose." With these words, she fumbled in her pocket and pulled out a small toothpick case. This she opened, when there issued from it a little enameled doll, so pretty and so nicely made that the queen, in spite of her grief, could not forbear admiring its beauty. "This is my goddaughter," continued the fairy, "and I have destined Zirphil from his birth to be her husband." The queen burst into tears and conjured Marmotta, by the most tender entreaties, not to expose her to the laughter of her subjects, who would ridicule her indeed if she were to announce to them such a marriage. "What do you mean by ridicule, madam?" said the fairy. "Ah, we shall see whether they have any occasion to ridicule my goddaughter, and whether your son ought not to adore her. I assure you that she is worthy of him in every respect. That she is small is true, but she has more wit than all the people in your kingdom put together. And when you hear her, you will be surprised yourself, for you must know that she can talk, and to some purpose. Come, little Princess Minikin," said she to the doll. "Talk a little to your mother-in-law and show her what you can do." Then the pretty Minikin skipped on to the queen's tippet, and complimented her in so tender and intelligent a manner that the queen suspended her tears and affectionately kissed the little princess. "Here, your majesty," said the fairy, "is my toothpick case. You can replace your daughter-in-law therein. I wish your son to accustom himself to her society before he marries her. However, I do not think it will require a very long time. Your obedience may soften my anger, but if you disobey my orders, you, your husband, your son, and your kingdom shall all feel the effects of my resentment. And above all, do not fail to replace her very early every evening in the case, for it is of great importance that she does not sit up late." With these words, the fairy lifted up her veil, and the queen fainted away with terror on perceiving a real living marmot, covered with black hair and having a head as large as an ordinary woman. Her attendants came to her assistance, and when she recovered from her swoon, she only saw the case which Marmotta had left. She was conveyed to bed, and the king was informed of her indisposition. He hastened to her apartment in violent agitation. The queen desired all her attendants to quit the room, and with a torrent of tears related what had transpired to his majesty, who would not believe a word she said until he saw her draw forth the doll from her little case. "Good heaven!" cried he, after meditating a few moments. "Is it possible that kings are liable to such severe misfortunes? Alas! We are only placed higher than other men to feel more acutely the sorrow and misfortunes inseparable from this life." "And to show greater examples of fortitude, sire," interposed the doll in a soft and clear voice. "My dear Minikin," said the queen, "you talk like an oracle." The king took her hand and kissed it. Finally, after an hour's conversation between these three personages, it was agreed that nothing should as yet be said about the marriage, and that they were to wait until Zirphil, who was then absent for 3 days on a hunting expedition, should determine to obey the fairy's orders, which the queen undertook to make known to him. Meanwhile, the king and queen paid the utmost attention to little Minikin. She had a highly accomplished mind. She spoke exceedingly well, and with a peculiarly lively turn, which was engaging. However, notwithstanding her animation, her eyes had a certain motionless stare which was not agreeable, and which the queen only overlooked as she began to love the little princess. She was, however, fearful that the prince might conceive an aversion to her on this account. More than a month had passed after Marmotta's visit, and the queen had not yet dared to introduce Zirphil to his proposed bride, when one morning that prince entered her apartment before she had risen, and, seating himself by her bedside, spoke as follows: "A few days ago, madam, while I was hunting, the most surprising adventure conceivable befell me, which I would fain have concealed from you, but the secret has become so burdensome to me that I feel I can withhold it from you no longer. It is now some days since that, as I was eagerly following a wild boar, I became so absorbed in its pursuit as not to observe that I had outstripped all my attendants, when, as I arrived at the outskirts of the forest, I all at once saw the animal precipitate himself into a large opening in the ground, into which my horse plunged after him. I felt myself descending into the earth for about half an hour, when my horse's hoofs came suddenly in contact with the floor. Looking about me, I saw, instead of the wild boar, which I confess I was somewhat fearful of meeting, a very ugly woman, who begged me to alight from my horse and follow her. I did not hesitate, and giving her my hand, she opened a little door which I had not before perceived, and I entered with her into a green marble saloon, in the middle of which stood a large golden tub, covered by a piece of rich cloth. This she raised, and I saw in the tub a lady of such surpassing loveliness that I could with difficulty preserve myself from falling backward with surprise. "Prince Zirphil," said the lady, who appeared to be bathing, "the fairy Marmotta has enchanted me here, and it is by your aid alone that I can be freed." "Speak, madam," said I. "Inform me how I can serve you." "You must," replied the lady, "either pledge yourself to marry me immediately, or scale me alive." My surprise at the first proposition could only be equaled by my horror at the alternative. She observed my embarrassment and continued, "Do not imagine that I am ridiculing you, or that I am making a proposal that you will have any reason to repent accepting. No, Zirphil, do not be alarmed. But I am an unfortunate princess, for whom the fairy has conceived a violent hatred, and whom she has metamorphosed into a creature half woman, half whale, because I refused to marry her nephew, the king of the Whitings, a young man the ugliness of whose person is only equaled by the wickedness of his actions. The fairy has condemned me to remain in the state in which you now see me until a prince named Zirphil shall have fulfilled one of the conditions I have just proposed to you. To bring this about, I caused my lady of honor to take the shape of a wild boar this morning in order to attract you hither. You know how my design has succeeded, but I must now inform you that you will not be allowed to quit this place until you have complied with either one or the other of my requests. This I cannot avoid, and Citronetta, whom you have already seen, will confirm to you the truth of my words." "Conceive, madam," said Prince Zirphil to the queen, who was listening with the greatest attention, "into what a state this speech threw me. Although I thought that the princess was very beautiful, and although her beauty and misfortunes made her extremely interesting, the idea of a whale princess inspired me with horror. On the other hand, the thought of scaling her alive made me frantic." "But, madam," said I at length, for the silence into which her discourse had thrown me was becoming as insupportable as it was unmannerly, "is there no third means of accomplishing what you desire?" I had no sooner pronounced these unlucky words than the princess and her attendant began to utter such piercing shrieks and lamentations as almost rent the roof of the saloon. "Ingrate! Barbarian! Tiger! Everything that is most ferocious and inhuman," said she. "You would then add to my punishment the horror of seeing you expire? For know that if you do not resolve at once to comply with my request, the fairy has assured me that you will perish, and that I shall remain in my present condition all my life." Her reproaches pierced my heart. She drew her beautiful arms from the water and clasped her lily-white hands to entreat me to decide quickly. Citronetta threw herself at my feet and embraced my knees, almost deafening me with her clamorous grief. "But how can I marry you?" said I. "How can the ceremony be performed in the first place?" "Scale me," she said tenderly, "and do not marry me at all. I shall be quite as well pleased." "Scale her," said the attendant, redoubling her entreaties, "and trouble yourself no further." I was in an inexpressible perplexity, and when I attempted to reflect how to act, their cries and tears only increased my confusion. At last, after 1,000 conflicting thoughts, I looked again on the beautiful whale princess, and her beauty triumphed. I knelt near the tub, and taking her fair hand, "No, adorable princess," I exclaimed, "I will not scale you. I prefer to marry you." The princess' joy at hearing these words was visible on her countenance, but it was a modest joy, for she blushed, and with downcast eyes she said, "I shall never forget the service you are about to do me. I am so penetrated with gratitude to you that you cannot ask me for anything that I will not grant you in return." "Come, lose no time," cried the impatient Citronetta, "but inform Prince Zirphil what remains for him to do." "It is only necessary," said the whale princess, blushing again, "for you to give me your ring and to receive mine. Here is my hand. Receive it as a pledge of my faith." No sooner had I made this tender exchange and kissed her fair hand that I found myself on my horse in the middle of the forest, where I was soon rejoined by my attendants, and I returned to the place mute with astonishment. Every evening since this took place, I have been transported, without knowing by what means, into the handsome green marble saloon where I pass the night in company with an invisible person who says she is my bride and who converses with me on the subject of our union. But, my son, interrupted the queen, and is it possible that you are really married? Yes, but although I am very fond of my wife, madam, resumed the prince, I would have restrained my passion for her if I could have disenchanted her without either marrying her or scaling her alive. As Zirphil pronounced these words, a small voice was heard from the queen's pocket, saying, Prince Zirphil, you should have scaled her, and your pity will perhaps be fatal to you. On hearing this voice, the prince was quite speechless with astonishment. In vain the queen attempted to conceal the speaker from him. He immediately fumbled in the pocket which was lying on an armchair which stood near the bed, and drew forth the case, which the queen took from his hand and opened. Princess Minikin then stepped from it, and the prince, in surprise, kneeling down by the queen's bedside to look at her more closely, exclaimed, Would you believe, madam, that this is the miniature counterpart of my beloved whale princess? The queen then informed her son of all that had passed on the fairy Marmotta's visit, at which Zirphil could not forbear showing a surprise not very flattering to Minikin. But she was so good-natured that when she saw the queen's affliction, she kissed her hand and could not refrain from tears. Zirphil was touched by this tender scene, and asked Minikin for her hand to kiss in its turn. With much grace and dignity she extended it to him, and then re-entered her case. When Zirphil had left the queen, she rose from her bed to inform the king of what she had heard and of what she had just witnessed, that they might take every reasonable precaution against the probable effect of the fairy's anger. The following night, Prince Zirphil, notwithstanding that his bodyguard had been doubled, was carried off as the clock struck 12, and found himself, as usual, in company with his invisible princess. But instead of being greeted with kind and tender language as heretofore, he heard weeping and sounds of grief, and observed that the princess kept a considerable distance from him. He ran after her round the apartment until he was tired, when, seating himself on a sofa, he exclaimed, What have I been guilty of that I deserve such unkind treatment? I know all, said the whale princess in a voice choked by sobs. Ingrate, have you forgotten the tenderness with which you kissed the hand of the Princess Minikin? The tenderness, returned Zirphil quickly. Ah, divine princess, are you so little acquainted with mine as to accuse me on so slight a ground? If I looked at Minikin attentively, it was only because her face exactly resembles yours, and being deprived of the pleasure of seeing you, all that resembles you fills me with delight. Conceal yourself no longer, my dear princess, and be sure that I will look at none but you. The invisible princess seemed to be consoled by those words, and drawing near the prince, Forgive me, said she, this little jealous suspicion. I have reasons enough to dread being separated from you, to be afflicted at anything that seems to forebode that misfortune. But, said Zirphil, can you not inform me why you are not permitted to make yourself visible to me? For if I have delivered you from Marmotta's tyranny, how is it that you are still under enchantment? Alas, said the invisible princess, if you had chosen to scale me, we should have been much happier. But you felt so much horror at that proposition that I dared not press you more. By what means, interrupted Zirphil, is Minikin acquainted with what has happened? For she said nearly the same thing to me. No sooner had he pronounced these words Then the whale princess uttered a piercing shriek and sprang off the sofa, and the prince, in astonishment, did so too. But what was his terror when he perceived the hideous Marmotta in the middle of the apartment, holding his beautiful princess by her flowing ringlets, no longer invisible, no longer half a whale. He drew his sword, but his princess, with tears and supplications, entreated him to moderate his anger, as it would be of no avail against the fairy's power, and the horrible Marmotta, gnashing her teeth, there issued from her mouth a violet-colored flame which singed his whiskers. "Prince Zirphil," said the fairy to him, "a fairy who guards you prevents me from exterminating you, your father, your mother, and all who are related to you, but you shall at least suffer in what is most dear to you for marrying without having consulted me, and your torments and those of your princess shall not cease until you are submitted to my power." As she finished these words, the fairy disappeared, together with the princess, the apartment, and the palace, and Prince Zirphil found himself in his own room, in his nightdress, and with his drawn sword in his hand. He was so astonished and so beside himself with anger that he did not observe that it was freezing, for it was then the middle of winter. On hearing his outcries, his guards rushed into his chamber and requested him either to go to bed or allow himself to be dressed. He chose the latter, and went straight to the apartment of the queen, who, on her part, had passed the night in the most dreadful anxiety. On going to bed, the queen was unable to sleep, and, being troubled with sorrowful thoughts, she resolved to impart them to the little Minikin. With that purpose she took the case, but in vain she shook it. Minikin was no longer there. The queen, fearful that she had lost her in the garden, rose from her bed and gave orders for torches to be lighted and a search to be made immediately. But in vain they searched. Minikin had vanished, and the queen returned to her bed in a transport of grief with which she was overwhelmed when her son entered her apartment. He was himself in such affliction that he did not perceive that his mother was in tears. The queen, therefore, when she noticed his agitation, said, "Ah, doubtless you are come to announce some terrible calamity?" "Yes, madam," answered Zirphil. "I am come to inform you that I wish to live no longer if I do not find my dear princess." "How, my son?" said the queen. "Are you already in love with that unfortunate princess?" "What, with your Minikin?" said the prince. "Is it possible that you can even suspect me? Alas, my dear whale princess has been torn from me. For her only I wish to live, and Marmotta, the cruel Marmotta, has dragged her from me." "Ah, my son," said the queen, "I am still more afflicted than you are, for if you are deprived of your whale princess, I have to regret the loss of my Minikin, who since last evening has disappeared from the case." Then the queen and Zirphil related to each other the misfortunes that had befallen them. The king was promptly informed of the queen's despair and outcries, and also of his son's sorrow. He entered the apartment in the midst of the scene we have described, and informed himself of what had occurred. As he was very sagacious, the thought immediately struck him to have Minikin advertised and to offer a large reward to whoever should bring her to the palace. Everybody thought this an admirable expedient, and the queen herself, notwithstanding her sorrow, was obliged to agree that no one but the most transcendent genius could have hit upon so singularly felicitous a scheme. Accordingly, handbills were printed and distributed, and the queen consoled herself with the hope of soon receiving intelligence of her little princess. As for Zirphil, the loss of Minikin interested him as little as her presence. He came to the resolution of seeking out a certain fairy of whom he had heard, and having obtained permission of the king and queen, he set out immediately, attended only by his equerry. The country in which the fairy lived was situated at an immense distance from that of the prince, but neither time nor obstacle could stop the amorous impatience of the young Zirphil. He passed through kingdoms and countries out of number. Nothing particular occurred to him because he was determined that nothing should, for beautiful as Cupid and brave as a lion, adventures would have befallen him if he had been willing to seek them. At last, after he had been a year on his travel, he arrived at the borders of the desert in which the fairy resided. He alighted from his horse and left his equerry to await his return in a little hut, with orders not to be impatient for his coming. He entered on the desert, which was indeed frightfully solitary. It was inhabited only by owls, but their dismal screechings did not dismay the soul of our courageous prince. Sustained by his unconquerable intrepidity and by the hope of meeting with the beneficent fairy, he did not hesitate an instant, but penetrated into that region which until then had never been trodden by mortal feet. After night had set in, he perceived afar off a light which made him think that he was approaching the fairy's grotto, for no one but a fairy could reside in that horrible desert. He continued to direct his steps toward it during the whole of the night, and at last, about daybreak, he discovered the celebrated grotto. He arrived at the foot of a prodigiously high rock, which seemed to be of fire, such was its brilliancy. It was a carbuncle of such an immense size that the fairy had a very spacious residence therein. When Prince Zirphil had reached her grotto, the fairy Effulgent appeared to him. He prostrated himself before her, when she desired him to rise and follow her into the grotto. "Prince," said she to Zirphil, "a power equal to mine has partly counteracted the happiness with which I endowed you at your birth, but you may expect everything from my protection. You must have as much patience as courage to overcome Marmotta's wickedness. I can tell you no more." "At least, madam," answered the prince, "do me the favor to inform me if the beautiful whale princess is unhappy, and if I may hope to see her again soon." "She is not unhappy," said Effulgent, "but you cannot hope to see her again until you have pounded her in the mortar of the King of the Whitings." "Oh, heavens!" cried Zirphil. "Is it possible, madam, that she is in his power? Alas, then I have to dread the effects of his passion for her, in addition to the horror I feel at having to pound her with my own hands." "Arm yourself with courage," answered the fairy, "and do not hesitate to obey me. On that all your happiness will depend, and also that of your wife." "But she will die if I pound her," continued the prince, "and I would sooner suffer death myself." "Go," said the fairy, "and make no reply. Every moment that you lose adds to Marmotta's fury. Hasten to the King of the Whitings. Tell him that you are the page promised him by me, and rely on my protection." Then Effulgent pointed out to him on a map his road to the court of the King of the Whitings, and dismissed him, after apprising him that the ring he had received from his whale princess would instruct him how to act when the king gave him anything difficult to perform. He set out, and, after journeying several days, arrived at a meadow close to the seaside, where there was moored a little sailing boat, built of mother of pearl and ornamented with gold. He looked at his ruby ring, and saw his shadow sitting in the boat, so he jumped on board, and, having unmoored it, the wind drove it out to sea. He was soon out of sight of land, and after being driven before the wind for several hours, the boat stopped at the foot of a crystal palace built on piles. He sprang on the landing place, and entered a court which led to a superb vestibule and to a numerous suite of apartments, all the walls of which were rock crystal, admirably engraved, presenting the most charming effect imaginable. This castle was the palace of the King of the Whitings, and its only inhabitants were men with fishes' heads. The prince had no doubt as to where he was. He felt his choler rising, but he controlled it to ask of a turbot, who looked like a captain of the guard, where he could find the King of the Whitings. The man turbot gravely motioned him onward, and Zirphil passed into the guard room, where he saw 1,000 men with pikes' heads under arms, who fell into a double rank for him to pass through. At last, after making his way through an infinite crowd of menfish, he came to the presence chamber. He did not hear much noise in his progress, for the menfish were dumb, while he observed that the greater part of them had heads like the whitings. The prince saw in the anteroom several who appeared to be of high rank from the crowds which surrounded them, and from their own important looks. Zirphil had reached the king's closet just as the council, which was composed of 12 men with sharks' heads, was leaving his majesty. Presently the king himself appeared. He had, like so many of his court, the head of a whiting, but he also had fins on his shoulders, and from the waist downward was a real whiting. He had the gift of speech, and his only garment was a scarf of golden fish skin, which looked very splendid. On his head he wore a helmet shaped like a crown, whence depended the tail of a codfish, which served him instead of a plume of feathers. 4 men whitings were carrying him in a bowl made of Japanese porcelain, about the size of a bathing tub, and which was filled with sea-water. One of the greatest ceremonials at the court, and which was scrupulously exacted by the king, was the refilling of this bowl twice a day by the peers and dukes, his attendants. This employment was, however, considered a great honor, and was much sought after. The King of the Whitings was very tall, and looked more like a monster than anything else. After replying to some of those about him who had brought him petitions, he perceived the prince. "Who are you, my friend?" said his majesty. "What accident has brought a man here?" "May it please your majesty," answered Zirphil, "I am the page whom the fairy Effulgent promised to send to you." "Oh, I understand," said the king, laughing and showing his teeth, which looked like those of a saw. "Let him be taken to my seraglio, and let all my crawfish be shown him. Every morning he must choose 10 from among them, pound them in a mortar, and make me some broth." Zirphil was conducted to the seraglio, and while reflecting on his singular situation, he saw the doors open and 10 or 12,000 crawfish enter the room and arrange themselves in straight lines, nearly filling the apartment. The thought struck him that he might be able to discover his beautiful and unfortunate whale princess among them, as the hideous Marmotta had ordained that he should pound her in a mortar. "Why should I have to pound them," said he, "except it is to drive me mad? But never mind. Let me try to discover her," cried Zirphil, "that I may at least die of grief before her face." Then he asked the crawfish if they would allow him to search among them for one with whom he was acquainted. She, who appeared to be the chief, mounted on a table and said, "We are not aware that there is such a one among us, sir, but you may search until it is time for us to return to our pond, where it is absolutely requisite that we should pass the night." Zirphil commenced his researches, but it was like looking for a needle in a bundle of hay, and he only learned from those he interrogated that they were all princesses who had been transformed by the wicked Marmotta. He was inexpressibly grieved on hearing this, and to think that he would have to choose 10 of them every day for the king's broth. It was now getting late, and they informed Zirphil that it was time for them to return to their pond. But it was not without pain that the prince should consent to forego the pleasure of searching, however fruitlessly, for his dear princess. He had not been able during the whole day to speak to more than 150, but as he was at least certain that she was not among those, he resolved to take 10 from their number. He did so, and having taken them to a man-pike, who was the head cook, the latter inspected them and brought Zirphil a green porphyry mortar and a golden pestle, and having shown the prince how to place them, he made signs for him to begin pounding. He was about to do so when the bottom of the mortar opened amid shouts of laughter and sent forth a bright flame which dazzled the prince's eyes for a moment, and then expired, leaving the bottom of the mortar as before. Zirphil looked into it, but nothing was there. The crawfish had disappeared, at which he was very much astonished, but withal pleased, for he did not relish the idea of having to pound them. The man-pike seemed to regret what had taken place, and wept bitterly. The prince was as much surprised at seeing the head cook's grief as at the laughter of the crawfish, but he could not learn what occasioned either, as the crawfish were gone and the man-pike could not speak. Prince Zirphil, pondering on what he had witnessed, returned to his pretty apartment, where he no longer saw the crawfish, they having returned to their pond. The next morning, when the crawfish entered, he again sought for his princess, and, not finding her, he chose 10 of the finest of them and took them to the kitchen. The same adventure occurred as before. The flame came from the mortar, the crawfish disappeared laughing, and the man-pike wept. A similar occurrence happened every day for 3 months, but as Zirphil heard no more of the king of the Whitings, his only sorrow was that he could not find his beautiful whale princess. One evening, as Zirphil was returning from the kitchen to his room, he had occasion to pass through the palace gardens. As he passed near the palisade which surrounded a charming grove, in the middle of which was an artificial cascade, he heard the sound of voices, which not a little surprised him, for he thought all the inhabitants of that country were dumb, like those he had seen. He walked more softly and heard a voice say, "But, my princess, so surely as you never discover yourself, so surely your husband will never recognize you." "What would you have me do?" said the other voice, which Zirphil immediately recognized as one which he had so often heard. "The tyranny of Marmotta obliges me to act as I do, and I cannot discover myself without endangering my life and his. The wise fairy Effulgent, who sent me there, conceals me from him, for the purpose of preserving us for each other. It is absolutely necessary that he should pound me. It is an irrevocable decree." "Whence comes it that the prince must pound you?" said the other. "You have never consented to relate your history to me, though the unfortunate Citronetta, your confidant, would have informed me of it if she had not been selected last week for the king's broth." "Alas," replied the whale princess, "that unfortunate creature has then already undergone the fate which awaits me. Would that I were in her place. Surely she is now in Effulgent's grotto." "Do," said the other voice, "since it is so fine an evening, inform me, why are you submitted to Marmotta's vengeance? I have already told you who I am, and I repeat that I am burning with impatience to learn your history." "Well," said the princess, "although it will only renew my grief, I cannot refuse to satisfy you. Besides, I shall have to speak of Zirphil, and I abandon myself with joy to all that can recall his image to my mind." It is easy to imagine the prince's joy at overhearing this tender confession. He softly glided into the grove, and, as it was now quite dark, he could neither see nor be seen. He listened, however, with the utmost attention, and overheard as follows. "My father was king of a certain country situated near Mount Caucasus. He governed as well as he could a people of incredible wickedness. Insurrections were perpetually shaking his throne, and the windows of his palace were frequently shattered to pieces by stones intended for himself. The queen, my mother, who was very clever and highly accomplished, composed for him harangues to appease the rioters, but if he were successful one day, on the next there was infallibly another insurrection. The judges were tired of condemning to death, and the executioners of hanging and beheading the criminals. At last, things arrived at such a crisis that, seeing all his provinces in rebellion, and his people in arms against him, my father resolved to retire into the country that he might no longer witness the dreadful condition of his affairs. He took his queen with him, and left the kingdom to be governed by one of his ministers, a man wiser and of bolder spirit than the king, my father. Our wicked subjects lighted bonfires at their departure, and the next day strangled the minister, declaring that he wanted to act the king, and that they preferred even their old one to him. My father was not at all flattered by their preference, and did not therefore quit the retirement of his little country house, where I was born. I was called Minikin because I was very small, and, as the king and queen, tired of honors that had cost them so dearly, wished to conceal my birth from me, they brought me up as a shepherdess. At the end of 10 years, which appeared to my parents no longer than 10 minutes, so contented were they with their retreat, the fairies who inhabited Mount Caucasus, indignant at the persevering wickedness of the inhabitants of my father's late kingdom, resolved to restore it to order. One day, as I was tending my flock in the meadow that joined our garden, 2 old shepherdesses accosted me and entreated me to give them a night's lodging. They looked so weary and so sorrowful that I instantly took compassion on them. "Come," said I to them, "my father, who is a shepherd, will be willing to receive you." I then ran to our cottage to tell him that they were coming. He went out to meet them and received them very kindly, as did the queen, my mother. I then collected my sheep and fetched some new milk for our guests, and while my father was preparing something nice for supper, the queen, who, as I have already told you, was very intelligent, entertained them with her conversation. I had a little lamb of which I was excessively fond. My father told me to bring it to him that he might put it down to roast. I was not in the habit of refusing to do as I was desired, so I fetched my lamb immediately. But I was so afflicted that I ran to my mother and burst into tears. She was, however, so much engaged in talking to the good women that she did not observe me. "What is the matter with little Minikin?" said one of them, seeing me in tears. "Alas, madam," said I to her, "my father is about to roast for you my little pet lamb." "What?" said she who had not spoken. "Is it for us that they are going to be so cruel to the pretty Minikin?" Then, rising from her seat, she struck the floor with her wand, and there instantly appeared a table on which was spread a magnificent feast. At the same time, the 2 old shepherdesses were transformed into 2 ladies, so handsome and so glittering with jewels that I was motionless with surprise at seeing them. My father and mother immediately began to testify their respect for the 2 fairies, for you may be sure that fairies they were. Raising them from their feet, where the king and queen had thrown themselves, "King and queen," said the more majestic of the 2, "we have known you for a long time, and your misfortunes have excited our pity. Do not think that a high station is exempt from the evils attendant on human life. You ought to know from experience that the higher the rank, the greater the liability to misfortune. Your patience and virtue, however, have lifted you above your hard fate, and it is time they should be rewarded. I am the fairy Effulgent, and I am come to ask you what can most contribute to your happiness. Speak, and do not be afraid of putting our power to the test. Consult together, and your wishes shall be accomplished. But do not let your request have reference to Minikin. Her destiny is apart from yours. The fairy Marmotta, jealous of the brilliant career before your daughter, has condemned her to obscurity for a certain period, but Minikin will be better able to appreciate the happiness of life after she shall have known some of its evils. We will protect her and mitigate her fate. This is all we are permitted to unfold to you. Now, Speak. Anything that you can ask shall be granted." The fairies were silent after this harangue. The queen turned to the king and requested him to make answer, for she was in tears at learning that I was destined to be unfortunate. But neither was my father in a condition to speak. He uttered lamentable cries, and I, seeing my parents weep, quitted my lamb to join my tears to theirs. The good fairies, affected by the extreme grief which prevailed in the royal family, spoke a few words apart. Then Effulgent, who had already spoken, said to the queen, "Be consoled, madam. The misfortunes with which Minikin is threatened are not so bad, since they will terminate happily. For from the moment that the husband we have destined for her shall have performed what fate shall require of him, Minikin will be happy for the remainder of her life, and our sister will have no further power over either of them. We have allotted her to a prince who is every way worthy of her. All that remains for us to say is that it is absolutely necessary you should lower your daughter every morning into the well and let her bathe there during the space of half an hour. If you scrupulously observe this rule, perhaps your daughter may avoid the misfortune with which she is menaced, and it is at the age of 12 years that her destiny will be fulfilled. If she reach 13 without its coming to pass, there will be no longer anything to fear. So much for Minikin. For yourselves, express but your wishes, and they shall be gratified." The king and queen looked at each other, and after a short silence, the former requested to be changed into a statue until my 13 probationary years should be accomplished, while the latter confined her wishes to requesting that the temperature of the well in which I was to be bathed might always be adapted to the season. The fairies, charmed with this excess of tenderness, granted in addition that the well should be filled with orange flower water, and that the king, whenever the queen should throw some of this water over him, should resume his natural form, and be changed into a statue again whenever he should wish. Then the fairies took their leave of us, after having praised the king and queen for their moderation. They disappeared, and I felt grief for the first time in my life at seeing the king, my father, become a large statue of black marble. The queen gave way to tears, and I also, but at last, as everything has an end, I ceased to cry and only thought of consoling my mother, for my mind was highly intellectual and my heart capable of the deepest feelings. The queen passed nearly all her time at the feet of the statue, and I, after being bathed, according to the fairy's instructions, went regularly to milk our sheep. This milk formed our principal food, for the queen was too weak to have an appetite for anything else. Indeed, it was only her love for me that made her wish to prolong a life which seemed so unfortunate. "Alas, my child, would she say to me occasionally, "of what avail to us has been our high rank?" For she no longer concealed from me my birth. Would not a less elevated station have been preferable to a crown attended with such grievous misfortunes? Virtue alone, joined to my affection for you, my dear Minikin, enables me to support them, but there are moments when my soul seems anxious to quit my body, and when I confess that I feel a pleasure in the certainty that I must die. I was regularly bathed every day, and my mother was very much afflicted at seeing the king always remain an inanimate statue. However, she dared not recall him to life, for fear that she should only cause him the grief of witnessing my predicted misfortune. The fairies not having specified in what way my fate was to affect me, we were in a dreadful state of anxiety, the queen in particular. Her imagination, having a vast field for its exercise, foreboded to her the most frightful misfortunes, and had no bounds to its fears. For my part, I soon ceased to think upon the subject. So true is it that youth is the only season in which we enjoy the present. My mother was continually saying that she had a great mind to recall the king to life, which I advised her to do. At last, at the end of 6 months, seeing that the fairy's bath had made me very beautiful and had improved my understanding, which was maturing from day to day, she resolved to gratify herself, in order, as she said, to give the king the pleasure of seeing me, so she desired me to fetch her some water from the well. Accordingly, the next morning, when I had bathed, I brought up with me a jug filled with this miraculous water, and the moment that my mother sprinkled some drops of it on the statue, my father became a man again. The queen threw herself at his feet to ask his pardon for disturbing his repose. My father raised her and embraced her tenderly. Peace was concluded, and she presented to him his daughter. The king was delighted with me and lavished on me 1,000 caresses. Then, turning to the queen, he asked her if she had any news. "Alas," said my mother, "how should any reach me in this desert?" "Well then," said the king, "you shall hear some from me, for I have not been asleep all this time as you supposed. The fairies who protect us have shown me that my subjects have been terribly punished for their wickedness, my kingdom being transformed into one vast lake, and the inhabitants into so many men-fish. A nephew of the fairy Marmotta, whom they have placed upon the throne, persecutes them with unceasing cruelty. He eats them up for the slightest offense. At the end of a certain period, the exact duration of which is unknown to me, a prince will come who shall reign in his stead, and in the kingdom, which will be then re-established, Minikin will enjoy a long life of happiness. That is all I have learned, and I have not passed my time very idly," said the king, laughing, "to have learned so much." We passed some time very happily indeed. The king and queen, however, were rather sorrowful when they remembered that I was approaching my 13th year. As the queen was very careful to bathe me every day, she still hoped that the prediction would not be fulfilled. But who can boast of having evaded his destiny? One morning, the queen having risen early, while she was plucking some flowers to adorn our mantelpiece, for the king was very fond of flowers, she saw crawling from under a tuberose tree an ugly animal, something like a marmot. The beast sprang at my mother and bit her nose, when she fainted away with pain and the fright caused by so sudden an attack. My father, uneasy at her absence, went to seek her, and you may judge of his horror at finding his wife weltering in her blood and nearly dead. He uttered frightful cries, which soon brought me to his assistance, and between us we bore the queen to our cottage and laid her on her bed, where she lay insensible for 2 hours. At last she began to give signs of returning consciousness, and in a few moments we had the extreme pleasure of seeing her perfectly restored, except that the wound she had received was exceedingly painful. Her first question was whether I had been bathed, but we had been so much engaged attending to her that I had forgotten my bath. On hearing this, my mother was dreadfully alarmed, but seeing that no accident had as yet befallen me, she soon became tranquil, and related to us the particulars of her misfortune, at which we were very much surprised. However, the day passed without any other mischance. The king had taken down his fowling piece, and made a diligent search after the vile brute, but in vain. He could not find it. The next morning at daybreak, the queen arose and took me to the well. She lowered me therein as usual, but alas, oh fatal and miserable day! At that moment the sky, although still perfectly serene, echoed with a dreadful thunder, while the day was rendered more brilliant by a fearful lightning, and there issued from a burning cloud which suddenly arose a fiery dart which rushed into the well. Terrified, my mother quitted her hold of the cord that held me, and I was precipitated to the bottom of the well, when I immediately became sensible that the lower half of my body was transformed into so much of an enormous whale. I swam about for a short time, and then began calling on the queen with all my might. She did not answer, at which I was very much afflicted, and I was crying very bitterly, as much for the loss of my mother as at my metamorphosis, when I felt an unknown power forcing me to descend, and, having arrived at the bottom of the water, I entered a crystal grotto, in which I observed a sort of nymph, shaped like a frog, but exceedingly large and rather dirty. However, she smiled when she saw me, and said, "Minikin, I am the nymph of the bottomless well, and am called Citronetta. I have orders to receive you here, and to make you perform the penance to which you are doomed for having omitted your bath. Follow me, and make no reply." She took hold of my tail and dragged me unresistingly into a green marble saloon, which was near her grotto, and there placed me in a golden tub full of water, when I began to recover my spirits. The good nymph appeared to be in ecstasies. I informed her of the events of my life, and then begged her to tell me what was become of the king and queen. She was about to answer me when a frightful marmot, as large as a human creature, entered the saloon and froze me with horror. She walked upright on her hind legs, leaning on a golden wand. She came up to the tub, in which I would fain have drowned myself, I was so terrified, and touched me with her wand. "Minikin," she said to me, "you are in my power, and nothing can withdraw you from it but your obedience and that of the prince whom my sisters have destined to be your husband. Listen to me, and divest yourself of your fear, which does not become the daughter of a king. From your infancy I wish to protect you and marry you to my nephew, the king of the Whitings. Effulgent, however, and 2 or 3 more of my sisters had already taken upon themselves to provide you with a husband, and, angry in consequence, I let the effects of my ill humor fall upon you. Having no power over my sisters, I resolved to punish you for their stubbornness, and so ordained that you should be transformed into a creature, half woman, half whale, for at least the half of your life. My sisters cried shame on such injustice, so I was induced to diminish the effects of my vengeance, but for my complaisance, I reserved to myself the determination of marrying you to my nephew. Effulgent, who is somewhat imperious, and whose power is unfortunately superior to mine, would not hear of this reservation, because she had destined you for a prince who was under her protection. I was accordingly obliged to accede to her wishes, notwithstanding my resentment, and all that I could obtain was that the one who should deliver you from my power should become your husband. These are their portraits," added the fairy, handing to me 2 golden cases. "You will know them by their likenesses, and if one of them should come to deliver you, it is necessary that he should promise to marry you in your present condition, and in order that you may quit it, he must tear off all your scales one by one, otherwise you will remain half a fish all your life. My nephew will not have the slightest objection to this proposition, but with regard to the protege of Effulgent, he will not at all like the latter condition, for he appears to me to be a very delicate young gentleman. Employ, then, your utmost address to make him scale you, and that achieved, your misfortunes will cease. If indeed it be a misfortune to be a very beautiful whale, fat and well fed, with water up to your neck." This speech, to which I made no reply, made me very sorrowful, both on account of my metamorphosis and of the scaling I was doomed to undergo. Marmotta disappeared, leaving us the 2 boxes which contained the portraits. I was weeping at the thoughts of my unfortunate situation, quite regardless of the boxes, when the kind and compassionate Citronetta said, "Come, let us not lament misfortunes which it is not in our power to remedy. Let us amuse ourselves by examining the portraits." With that, she opened one of the 2 boxes, and, showing it to me, we both uttered a shriek of horror on seeing the portrait of an ugly whiting, on which, however, the artist had bestowed as much beauty as he could, but still never in the memory of man was anything seen so frightful. "Take the detestable object from my sight," said I. "I cannot endure to look on it longer. I would sooner remain a whale all my life than marry the horrible whiting." My companion did not give me time to finish my imprecations on the monster. "See," said she, "look at this young beauty. I declare that he may scale you whenever he chooses, and you will be but too happy to suffer by his hands." I quickly turned to see if what she stated were true, and was but too soon convinced. A handsome and agreeable countenance presented itself to my sight. Tender and expressive eyes gave a finishing charm to a set of features in themselves noble and majestic. I gazed on this charming portrait with a pleasure of which I was myself unconscious, and which I had never felt till then. Citronetta was the first to remark it. "In good faith," said she, "our choice is soon made." I awakened the good-natured Citronetta 20 times in the course of the night to converse with her about my prince, and she soon found out his name for me, and informed me that he hunted almost every day in the forest under which I was incarcerated. She proposed to me that she should try to entice him to our abode, but I would not consent, although I was dying with anxiety to see it accomplished. One day, when I was more low-spirited than usual, for love has this peculiarity, that it disposes the tender heart to melancholy, I saw the frightful Marmotta enter the saloon, accompanied by 2 persons whom I did not immediately recognize. It instantly struck me that she was bringing her unlucky nephew, and I uttered frightful cries. They hastened up to me, and I heard the wicked Marmotta say, "Why, she could not make more noise if they were scaling her. She cries out before she is hurt." "Good heaven, sister," said one of the persons who accompanied her, and in whom I recognized with joy the 2 fairies who had formerly visited my father's cottage, "let us hear no more for the present about the scaling, but let us tell Minikin what we have got to say to her." "Oh, by all means," said Marmotta, "but you know the conditions." The good fairy, without heeding or replying to her words, spoke to me as follows: "Minikin, we are too much afflicted by your unhappy condition not to endeavor to change it, and especially as you have not deserved it. I and my sisters have therefore determined to lighten your misfortune as much as may be in our power. Our scheme is this: you are going to be presented at the court of the prince to whom I have destined you from your cradle. But, my dear child, you will not appear there in your present form, although you are destined to return to it 3 times a week, and pass the night in your tub. For until you are married—" "And scaled," interrupted the hideous Marmotta with a sardonic grin. The good fairy turned toward her, shrugged up her shoulders, and immediately continued: "For until you are married, you will remain a whale here. More than this we cannot tell you, but you will learn all in good time. Above all, be very careful to keep your secret, for if a single word escape you which has a tendency to make it known, neither I nor my sisters can assist you more, and you will be wholly in the power of my sister Marmotta." "Which she will be," said that wicked fairy. "I already see her in my clutches. A secret kept by a girl indeed would be a phenomenon." "That is her business," said Effulgent, for it was she who had been speaking to me all along. "As to the rest, my daughter," she continued, "you will be changed into a little enameled doll, but will retain both reason and speech, and we will preserve your real features. And now I give you a week to consider whether what I have proposed be agreeable to you." There wanted only 1 day to the fairy's appointment when Citronetta, who had assumed the shape of a wild boar, and had gone to the forest to procure me news of Zirphil, returned, followed by that too amiable prince. I cannot express to you my joy at seeing him. There are no words expressive enough to convey even a distant idea of what I felt. But what delighted me most was to perceive that the prince appeared enchanted with me. At least I inferred so from his looks. Citronetta, more anxious for my happiness than for our momentary transport, dissipated it by proposing to Prince Zirphil to marry me or to scale me. Brought back to recollection, and feeling the danger of our situation, I joined my tears and entreaties to Citronetta's, and by our supplications we induced the prince to pledge to me his faith. We had no sooner exchanged rings than he vanished unaccountably from my sight, and I found myself in my proper shape, lying in a comfortable bed. I was no longer troubled with the thoughts of being metamorphosed. Still, I was confined in the bowels of the earth, in the green marble saloon, and Citronetta had lost the power of quitting it and of transforming herself. I expected the return of the fairies with fear and trembling. Marmotta appeared at daybreak, unaccompanied by Effulgent or her companion, and not looking more angry than usual. She touched me with her wand, without saying a word, and I became a charming little doll, when, having put me in her toothpick case, she transported herself to the palace of the queen, my husband's mother. She gave me to her with orders to espouse me to her son, or expect all the misfortunes that lay in her, Marmotta's, power to draw upon her, adding that I was her goddaughter and called the Princess Minikin. I conceived a very strong friendship for my mother-in-law. I loved her for her good qualities, independent of her being the mother of my adored Zirphil, and I was blessed with her friendship in return. I was transported, however, every night to the green marble saloon in company with my husband. I cannot divine why I was forbidden to tell him my secret, since I was married to him. However, I did keep it, notwithstanding Zirphil's impatience to learn it. You are about to see, continued the speaker, sighing, that it is impossible to avoid the doom of fate. However, she added, it is nearly daybreak, and I am dreadfully fatigued with being so long out of the water, so let me return to the pond, and tomorrow at the same hour, if we are not chosen for the broth of the wretched king of the Whitings, we will resume the thread of my story. Come, let us be moving. Zirphil heard no more and returned to his apartment, very sorrowful at not having apprised his princess that he was so near her, but the fear of increasing her misfortunes by his indiscretion consoled him for not having attempted to do so. However, the dread of her perishing by his own hands made him resolve to resume his inquiries among the crawfish, and to learn their histories. Prince Zirphil went to bed, but not to sleep. He could not close his eyes all night. To have discovered his princess, to see her in the shape of a crawfish, and in danger of being sacrificed to appease the appetite of the king of the Whitings, seemed to the prince to be a more dreadful punishment than the death to which he believed she was destined. He was in a cruel state of agitation when a loud noise was heard in the garden. At first, Zirphil only heard it faintly, but on listening, he distinguished the sounds of flutes and conch shells. He sprang out of bed and looked through the window, when he saw the king of the Whitings, accompanied by the 12 men sharks who had composed his council, walking in the direction of his pavilion. Zirphil hastened to open the door, and the procession having entered, the king, in the first place, had his tub refilled with fresh sea-water by the lords who were carrying him. Then, after a few minutes' rest, he took his place in the council, and addressed the young prince as follows. Whoever you may be, you are apparently resolved that I shall die of hunger, for you send me day after day such wretched broth that I cannot swallow a spoonful. Then, turning to an attendant, his majesty added, Go to my kitchen and bring me the crawfish mortar. I would regale the council." A man-pike immediately ran and fetched what the king desired, and while he was gone, the 12 men-sharks took a large net and cast it through the window into the pond, catching 3,000 or 4,000 crawfish. During the interval in which the council was employed fishing, and while the man-pike was gone for the king's pestle and mortar, Zirphil was absorbed in reflection. He felt that the most critical moment of his whole life was at hand, and that the question of his happiness or misery was about to be determined. But, summoning all his fortitude and resolution, he prepared to obey the king. The council ceremoniously presented the crawfish, and the prince attempted to pound some of them, but a similar adventure happened with these as had occurred with those which he had attempted to pound in the kitchen. The bottom of the mortar opened, and flames devoured them. The king of the Whitings and his rascally courtiers amused themselves for a long time with the extraordinary spectacle, taking great pains and apparently receiving much pleasure in continually refilling the mortar, until at last there was only one of the 4,000 crawfish remaining. This was so large and plump that it was charming to look upon. The king gave orders that someone should chill it, in order that he might eat some portion of this at least, and it was accordingly handed to Zirphil, who was not a little grieved at this new cruelty. But his grief was redoubled when he saw the poor crawfish join its 2 claws, and when its eyes streaming with tears, it said to him, "Alas, Zirphil, what have I done to you that you are about to treat me so cruelly?" The prince, deeply moved by the words, and with a heart pierced with grief, looked sorrowfully at the crawfish. At last he took upon himself to entreat the king to allow it to be pounded. The king, jealous of his authority and unshaken in his resolution, was inflamed with anger at this humble petition, and threatened to have Zirphil himself pounded if he did not immediately shell the crawfish. The poor prince again took it from the hands of one of the men-sharks to whom he had entrusted it, and with a little knife which was handed to him, began to shell it. But no sooner had the knife touched it than the crawfish uttered so piercing a cry that the prince turned away his eyes and could no longer repress his tears. After a while, however, he continued his disagreeable task, but to his astonishment, before he had well finished shelling the crawfish, it changed in his hands to the vile Marmotta, who, leaping on the floor, convulsed with loud and disagreeable laughter, mocked at Zirphil's grief. The prince, however, was at sight of her relieved from the oppressive fear under which he had been laboring, and which had nearly made him swoon. The king, in astonishment, cried out, "What? Is it possible that I behold my aunt?" "Yes, truly it is herself," said the tormenting creature. "But, my dear Whiting, I have come to inform you of terrible news." His Majesty turned pale on hearing these words, and the council assumed an air of satisfaction which quite disconcerted the king and his frightful aunt. "It is all over, my darling," continued Marmotta, "and you must return to your watery kingdom, for this obstinate creature has taken it into his head to be so ridiculously constant that I can do nothing with him. He has avoided all the snares that I laid in his way in the hope of diverting him from his determination to carry off the princess, whom otherwise I had destined for you." On hearing these words, the king of the Whitings went into such an excess of fury that words cannot describe it. He committed 1,000 extravagances, which made it very apparent that he was the prey of violent and ungovernable passions. Marmotta in vain attempted to appease him. Neither threats nor entreaties could prevail. He broke his china bowl in 1,000 pieces, when, all the water escaping, he swooned away. Marmotta, beside herself with anger, then turned to Zirphil, who had been a passive spectator of the violent scene, and said, "You have conquered, Zirphil, by the assistance of a fairy who is my superior in power. But all your sorrows are not yet over. You cannot be happy until after you have restored to my possession the case which contained the unlucky Minikin. Effulgent herself has granted me that, and I have obtained from her that you shall suffer until then." With these words, she threw the king of the whitings over her shoulders and bundled him into the lake, together with the men sharks, the palace, and all its inhabitants. And in a moment, Zirphil found himself alone at the foot of a high mountain, which stood in the midst of a large desert, in which there was not the least sign of vegetation, nor of a human habitation. He looked in vain for the lake and the palace. All had disappeared at once. The prince was more afflicted than astonished at so extraordinary an event. He had become familiarized with prodigies, and was only sensible of the grief caused him by Marmotta's persecution. "I cannot doubt," soliloquized Zirphil, "that I have pounded my princess. Yes, I have pounded her, and am no happier than I was before. Ah, barbarous Marmotta, and you, Effulgent, too! Even you leave me without assistance, after I have obeyed you at the sacrifice of all that so sensitive a heart as mine holds dear." His grief, and the weariness consequent on his having passed the previous night in the grove, made him feel so excessively faint that he would have most probably perished, but that his courage was unequaled, and his love inspired him with a wish to live. After walking onward for a long while, our prince came to the brink of a well which was cut through the rock. Here Zirphil sat down to rest himself, and began again to call on his protectress. "Oh, Effulgent," said he, "have you deserted me?" After repeating these words several times, he heard a voice proceeding from the well say, "If Zirphil is there, let him speak to me." The prince's joy at hearing this voice was increased by a hope that he recognized it as one to which his ear had been accustomed. He sprang to the brink, and answered therefore, "Yes, I am Zirphil. And you, are you not Citronetta?" "I am," said the voice, and Citronetta immediately arose from the well and embraced the prince. Words cannot paint Zirphil's joy at seeing her. He overwhelmed her with questions relative to herself and the princess, and it was some time before, the transport occasioned by their meeting being over, they spoke more rationally. "I am about to communicate to you," said Citronetta, "all that you are anxious to learn. Since you pounded us, we have enjoyed a happiness which your absence alone renders incomplete, and I was here awaiting your arrival, by the directions of the fairy Effulgent, that I might instruct you as to what remains for you to do, in order to become the happy possessor, without further trouble or fear, of a princess whose love for you equals that which I know you feel for her. But as some time must of necessity elapse before you can arrive at that happiness, I will do myself the pleasure to relate to you that part of the wonderful history of your amiable spouse, of which you are as yet unapprised." Zirphil kissed repeatedly the hands of Citronetta in token of his thanks, and followed her into her grotto, at the sight of which he was overcome with tender recollections, when he recognized it as the saloon in which he had for the first time seen his adored whale princess. At last, having seated himself and partaken of a repast which was furnished for him by his ring, he requested the good Citronetta to resume the history from the place where the princess had finished her narration. "As Effulgent will come to seek you here," said the nymph, "you shall in the meantime learn all that you wish to know. Know then that the fairy Marmotta was not ignorant of your marriage, but she had transformed our mutual friend into an enamel doll, thinking that you would be disgusted with her in that shape. Effulgent herself was, however, as you have heard, at the bottom of that affair, and well knew that no power could deprive you of the princess if you married her or destroyed her enchantment by scaling her. You married her, and you know what has since taken place. The last time that you saw the princess and myself, we were transformed into crawfish and placed in a little basket made of rushes, which Marmotta hung on her arm when seating herself in a chariot drawn by 2 adders. We were speedily conveyed to the palace of the king of the Whitings. This palace had formerly belonged to the king who is the father of your princess. The city, changed into a lake, formed the place where we have inhabited ever since, and all the menfish whom you saw were the wicked subjects of that good king, the latter requesting to be made yeoman of the kitchen and keeper of the pestle and mortar to the king of the Whitings. Effulgent gratified him by giving him a tap with her wand, when he immediately became a man-pike, such as you saw him in the discharge of his duty. Now you need no longer be surprised at the tears you saw him shed when you brought the crawfish to be pounded, for as he knew that his daughter had to undergo that punishment, he always feared that she might be among those which you brought him from time to time, and the unfortunate king had not a moment's peace because his daughter had no means of making herself known to him. For the queen, she requested to be transformed into a crawfish in order to be with the princess, and her wish was likewise granted. With regard to ourselves, when we arrived at the palace, the fairy presented us to the king of the Whitings, and commanded him to have a basin of crawfish broth prepared every day, after which order we were thrown into the pond among the rest. At length you arrived, and we were presented to you, but we were not permitted to make ourselves known unless you should interrogate us, and we dared not infringe the law, so tired we were of submitting to its rigor, for having formerly disobeyed it in mere trifles. We were selected by you one morning, I and the queen, and we had not time to bid the princess adieu ere you carried us to the kitchen. We had scarcely touched the bottom of the fatal mortar when Effulgent herself came to save us, and, on restoring me to my proper shape, she transported me to this, my usual residence. I had the consolation of seeing the queen and our companions likewise restored to their proper persons, but I do not know what has become of them. The fairy embraced me and told me to await you here, and inform you of all that I have just told you when you should arrive here in search of the princess. I had been looking forward to the present moment with impatience, as you may well believe, sir, continued Citronetta to Prince Zirphil, who was listening to her attentively, until at last, yesterday, just as I had seated myself at the mouth of my well, Effulgent appeared. Our children will soon be happy, said she to me. My dear Citronetta, Zirphil must restore to Marmotta her case as an end to his labors, for he has scaled the princess. Ah, great queen, cried I, are we then so happy as to have an end to our fears? Yes, said she, you are indeed. Zirphil thinks he has only scaled Marmotta, but he has in reality scaled the princess as Marmotta, being concealed in the handle of the knife wherewith he performed his terrible sacrifice at the moment that he finished shelling the crawfish, rendered the princess invisible to his eyes, and substituted herself, Marmotta, in her place. What? Exclaimed Zirphil. And was it then my charming princess to whom I acted with so much cruelty? Alas, have I been barbarous enough to make her suffer this cruel punishment? Oh, heavens! She will never forgive me, nor do I deserve her forgiveness. The unhappy Zirphil spoke so wildly, and appeared so grievously afflicted, that the poor Citronetta was herself grieved that she had communicated to him this cruel piece of intelligence. So, said she at last, seeing the prince in a reverie, so you did not know this? I did not indeed, answered Zirphil. For had I known it was my princess, I would rather have stabbed myself to the heart with the unlucky knife. But reflect, said Citronetta, that if you had stabbed yourself to the heart, the princess would have remained forever in the power of her enemy and of your detested rival, and that it is much better to have shelled her than, by killing yourself, to have allowed her to remain miserable. This last argument, founded on the real state of the question, soothed the prince's grief, and Citronetta prevailed on him to take a little food to keep himself alive, Just as they had finished their little repast, the vault of the saloon opened, and Effulgent appeared, seated in a car made of a large carbuncle, and drawn by 100 butterflies. She alighted, assisted by the prince, who bathed the hem of her robe with a torrent of tears. The fairy raised him and said, "Prince Zirphil, you will this day reap the fruit of your heroic actions. Be comforted. At last you will enjoy true happiness. I have overcome the fury of Marmotta by my entreaties, and your fortitude has disarmed her. Come with me to receive your princess from her hands and mine." "Ah, gracious madam," cried the prince, throwing himself on his knees, "am I not in a dream? Is it possible that so much happiness can be real?" "Do not doubt it," said the fairy. "Come with me, sir, to your kingdom to console the queen, your mother, for your absence and for the death of the king, your father. Your subjects are impatient to crown you." The prince felt, notwithstanding his joy, a very lively grief on hearing the news of the king his father's death, but the fairy, to withdraw him from his sorrow, seated him by her side in her car, and allowed Citronetta to establish herself at their feet. Then her butterflies displayed their brilliant wings and took the direction of Zirphil's dominions. On their route, the fairy desired him to look inside his ring. He did so, and found in it the case that he had to restore to Marmotta. The prince thanked the generous Effulgent 1,000 times, and they presently arrived at the kingdom, where they were awaited with so much impatience. The queen, Zirphil's mother, came to assist the fairy to alight from her car, and all the people, on being instructed of the prince's return, made such long and hearty acclamations that they partly dissipated the prince's grief. He tenderly embraced the queen, and they adjourned to a magnificent apartment prepared by her majesty for their reception, which they had no sooner entered than Marmotta arrived in a little chariot lined with Spanish leather, drawn by winged white rats. She brought with her the fair Minikin, in all the beauty of her natural figure, together with the king and queen, her father and mother. Effulgent and Zirphil's mother went out to receive and embrace Marmotta, and the prince, walking respectfully up to her, presented the toothpick case and kissed her paw, which she extended to him with a gracious smile. Marmotta then permitted Zirphil to embrace his wife, and to present her to his parent, who embraced her with transports of the most lively affection. A general interchange of civilities then took place among the numerous persons comprising this illustrious assemblage, and joy reigned in every breast. Minikin and her charming husband alone spoke not, so much as they had to say to each other. Their silence had a certain touching eloquence which affected everyone present. The good Citronetta shed tears of joy as she kissed the hands of her divine princess. At last Effulgent took them both by the hand, and leading them to the queen, Zirphil's mother, "Behold, madam," said she, "two young lovers who only await your consent to complete their happiness. My sister, the illustrious king and queen here present, and myself, all join to request its fulfillment." The queen, of course, consented in terms suitable to so polite a speech. Then Marmotta touched the fair Minikin with her wand, and her dress, which before had been magnificent, was immediately changed into one of silver brocade, embroidered all over with gold, and her beautiful hair instantly arranged itself into a coiffure of such exquisite taste that the kings and queens declared her dazzling charms to be absolutely perfect. In the meanwhile, the toothpick case, which the fairy held in her hand, became a crown of brilliant diamonds, so beautifully set and so bright that the apartment and all the palace received a new luster as Marmotta placed it on the prince's head. The prince, in his turn, was dressed in a suit which perfectly matched with Minikin's attire, and from the ring which he had received from that princess there issued a crown exactly like hers. They were immediately married and proclaimed king and queen of that fine country. The fairies provided the royal banquet, at which, as may be expected by those who know their extreme liberality, nothing was wanting. After staying a week with the young king and queen, and loading them with gifts, they departed, and restored Minikin's father and mother to their kingdom, the inhabitants of which had been so severely punished for their faults that they had become a loyal and faithful people. With regard to Citronetta, the fairies gave her permission to spend some time with her beloved mistress, and also arranged that Minikin, by expressing a wish, might have the pleasure of seeing the nymph whenever she pleased. The fairies having taken their departure, never were two persons so happy as King Zirphil and Queen Minikin. Their felicity was in themselves and in each other, and their days flew by unmarked in their course, for all was joy. They had children who blessed them by their goodness, and they attained an extreme old age, their mutual affection and desire of pleasing each other increasing with their years. After their decease, their kingdom was divided, and after innumerable vicissitudes, it has become, under one of their descendants, the flourishing empire of the great Mogul.